Is Putin secretly signaling the West that he wants to see the war end in its current state? But is Ukraine saying absolutely not? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is coming to us actually from Reuters, but Reuters reports that actually 3 sources independently have floated or leaked, at least to the press, that Vladimir Putin is interested in freezing the war in Ukraine with a ceasefire, recognizing recent Russian gains. And I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. But is this really something that Vladimir Putin would seriously consider? More importantly, is it something that Ukraine would consider, right? So these 3 separate sources have said that Putin doesn't seem to understand why the West is so hung up on Ukraine's territorial integrity. And it sort of, it makes a lot of sense. But the source said, quote, Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but he's also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war. They said freezing the conflict along current lines was for a long time a non-negotiable because it would give... I think this is a really strange wording from Sky News, but what they're saying is that Putin, for a long time, maintained that freezing the conflict in its current location was non-negotiable because Russia wouldn't control any Ukrainian oblast in its entirety, right? And he wanted to annex the entirety of Luhansk or Donetsk. And that's been a source of contention, even within Russia, where they say, "Okay, Russia, you've declared that the Luhansk People's Republic or whatever is now part of Russia, but you yourself don't explain where the borders of Russia's region lie, right? Because they're obviously always in flux." And of course, Zelensky himself has said, no, there's absolutely not going to be a ceasefire. It's literally impossible. And the U.S. State Department has made clear that any initiative for peace must, quote, respect Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. But according to at least these sources, Putin now believes that the current gains in the war are enough to sell to the Russian people that this has actually been a victory. Of course, you know that Russian forces, right, ramping up their attacks on Kiev, but the overall gains are unlikely, and even Putin seems to understand that any significant new advances are going to require a nationwide mobilization, something that he desperately wants to avoid. Even the initial mobilization wave produced a lot of unpopularity and a huge brain drain from Russia that, Russia as a population doesn't seem to have recovered from. And even Putin is signaling that they don't want this eternal war. But there's a few problems, right? The first problem is that for Russia, right, it controls all this territory. And frankly, Ukraine has said, listen, if we wanted to give up this territory to you, we would have done so, right? Like Ukraine could also signal, hey, we'll just freeze things where they are. And the U.S. has said, listen, we never recognized Russia's annexation of Crimea and the Donbass, let alone all these additional annexations. And this is the core problem, right? Is that Russia annexed Crimea and it faced minimal sanction, right? Then it annexed the Donbass region. And again, it faced minimal consequences from the international community. And in fact, the international community sort of started to try to recognize it, trying to establish these so-called Minsk Accords, which would establish kind of a ceasefire between the two and de facto recognition of these 2 annexed regions. And as a result, though, not only did the Minsk Accords never really end the fighting, all they did was give Russia a decade to prepare to invade and carve off more territory. And this is the core problem with giving Russia any portion of what it wants, of what it tried to annex, is that looking back, when Russia annexed Crimea, right, and the Donbass in 2014, the global community, Ukraine, the United States, Europe, we did not know that what this was a warm-up, that this was happening And that 8 years later, Putin would say, listen, the West, they don't really care if you cleave off territory of your neighbors. They're not going to do anything. They'll give you some sanctions. You'll circumvent them, and that'll be the end of it. And so Putin goes ahead and he says, 8 years later, he goes, yo, let's cleave off a little more territory. And then they try to, he actually is like, let's cleave off more territory. Let's annex all of Ukraine, because that's why he tried to march on Kiev. And so for the West, they sit there and go, listen, if we give this guy a portion of what he wants, all we're doing is kicking the can down the road. 8-10 years later, there's going to be another Russian military. It's going to have taken all the lessons it learned from this fight, and then it's going to roll into Kiev again, or it's going to roll into Latvia, or it's going to roll into Estonia or Lithuania, right? Like there's a bunch of places that sit there and go, no, we're not going to be the next Ukraine. And if you give Putin a victory, all you've shown is that you're delaying the inevitable, right? Because Putin's territorial ambitions aren't going to vanish. And the West has kind of realized this, right? We failed to realize it when in 2008 when Putin invaded Georgia, right? You remember he's also annexed large portions of Azerbaijan. And now, right then, subsequently, Crimea, Donbass, and now tried to actually regime change Kiev, and is now trying to annex dozens or 4 or 5 Ukrainian oblasts. And this, to me, is the West finally at last recognizing Russia is exactly who they say they are, right? Putin is someone with grand ambitions. He believes he believes Russia is a state that has been reduced to a fraction of its full historic territories, and that his duty as the head of Russia is to reinstate it, right? And again, he's someone who believes that Russia should control everything up to the German border. And so the West has to sit there, and it sucks, but we've got to sit there and say, listen, we can't give this person a win. We cannot sit there and be like, hey, you can't walk away from this with a win, guy. You need to understand that you played stupid games and you can't win a consolation prize. You got to play stupid games and you got to win stupid prizes. And your stupid prize needs to be that you get kicked out of Ukraine and humiliated. That's just the bottom line. And it seems like there's already some signs that this Russian offensive, this Russian summer offensive that they launched early, is already out of gas. Even Ukraine, we talked about for a while that this offensive actions by Russia seem stopped. And even Ukraine is sitting there and going, actually, we're pivoting to the counterattack now. We are actually going to start driving the Russians out of Kharkiv. Now, will that actually come to pass? Tough to say, because again, without the ability to strike Russian targets north of the international border, Russia's going to be able to refit, resupply, re-equip their troops and cycle them back into battle relatively easily. And that's actually a huge problem for Ukraine because they can do so without basically unimpeded. Anyway, if you feel like you need the ability to push back on all the challenges in your life, you don't need to rely on questionable international policy. You just need some strike gum. I guess I could orient it correctly. 90 milligrams caffeine in every piece, 0 sugar, right? And 5 pieces. Each one of these pieces contains all the caffeine of a Red Bull, plus 100 milligrams of alpha GPC for further cognitive clarity. It's made here in the USA with premium ingredients, including natural caffeine, right? It's, I could have done this a lot cheaper, but you know what? It would have sucked. And then, I'm not here to make a gum that sucks, right? Stuff is great. It is premium. It is better than better than most energy drinks, and it's better than every other caffeinated gum. So check us out, strikegum.com. We have the 5-pack that we just rolled out. If you're looking for that middle ground, we're also on Amazon. So pick some up, especially the 5-pack is on Amazon now. And if you pick it up and you have a 5-star experience, man, let us know on Amazon. You know, there's so many shady products there that I rely on you guys to tell other customers about Strike Gum. So your reviews mean everything to us. And a huge thank you to everyone that's purchased Strike Gum up until this point. Now, what I thought was also pretty interesting is that the U.S. is sending its own message about Putin's desires for a ceasefire with a $275 million tranche of this aid package, right? With more artillery and ammunition for Ukraine. So for Russia, it's probably a sign when you have these kind of folks who are, when Putin himself at this high a level is saying, let the West know I'd be happy to just take what I have, then that's a sign that Ukraine needs to double and triple down on its efforts. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to the Colonel tier members. Thanks to the Lieutenant tier members and all the members of CombatFitNews.com. Could not do this without you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.